Hi, I'm Hal Roberts. This is Bridge City News. Here's some of the top stories we've been following. A large group on Parliament Hill was pleading for the federal government to not include mental illness in medical assistance in dying. Reporter Brian Lilly stops by to explain why so many Canadian premiers have a problem with Federal Environment Minister Stephen Guilbeault. And Alberta police have a warning for parents to protect their kids from online predators who are encouraging kids to self-harm.
Your nation, your province, your southern Alberta. From the heart of Lethbridge, it's Bridge City News with Hal Roberts.
Thanks so much for joining us. The folks with Euthanasia Prevention Coalition were in Ottawa today, calling on the Senate to pass the government's Bill C-62 to block the extension of medical assistance in dying to people suffering solely from mental illness. The group also planned a large rally on Parliament Hill following the news conference.
For the position of the Euthanasia Prevention Coalition, it's obviously that we had welcomed the delay, but we actually oppose the concept of euthanasia for mental illness, the concept of even expanding to this. But we also recognize that we now have in Canada people who are living in poverty, people who are experiencing homelessness, people who are having difficulties receiving medical treatment, who are also dying by MAID, euthanasia, who would never have even considered to do so otherwise if the law weren't so lax and, how would you say, able to allow these people in these situations. So these are social decisions being made to cause death. And to me, that's completely unacceptable. So not only are we opposed to the euthanasia for mental illness, we're opposed to basically where the country has gone with this, and we recognize that it has to have a total and complete review.
Alberta MP John Barlow called on the Trudeau government to axe the carbon tax during question period. He says the tax has really been hurting our farmers, and with it going up April 1st, it won't be good news for Canadians.
The fact is, farmers are succeeding where the Liberal NDP carbon tax coalition is failing. And what is farmers' reward for this? A 23% increase in the carbon tax on April 1st. Common sense Conservatives will axe the tax and reward farmers for those accomplishments. Did you know that wheat grown in Canada can travel around the world 3.5 times before it has the same carbon footprint as wheat grown in Europe? Canadian farmers have accomplished this through innovation, not carbon taxes. Will the Liberals finally admit they were wrong, pass 234 unamended, and axe their plan to increase the carbon tax on April 1st?
I do find it quite ironic to be lectured by the Conservative Party on support to farmers when at the end of last year they voted against On-Farm Climate Action Fund to support sustainable agriculture. They voted against Dairy Innovation and Investment Fund for farmers, Mr. Speaker. They voted against funding in support of dairy, poultry, and egg supply management producers. On this side of the House, Mr. Speaker, we believe in our farmers, we support our farmers, and we help them to fight climate change.
Federal Industry Minister François-Philippe Champagne says he's seeing more stabilization when it comes to food prices across the country. He says a lot of that boils down to the Competition Bureau doing its job.
Ever since we summoned grocery CEOs to Ottawa last fall, we have seen a gradual stabilization of food inflation across the country. But more needs to be done to ensure that all Canadians' families can afford the grocery they need. I am pleased to see that after our government adopted our affordability bill in December, the Competition Bureau wasted no time to use its new powers, launching an investigation into potential anti-competitive restrictive covenants. Those are the famous clauses I talked to you about in leases where if you had one of the large grocers would for all purpose and intent, would basically restrict anyone of an independent or anyone else coming to within a certain radius to have competition.
It appears as though when it comes to Alberta's strained relationship with Ottawa, a lot of it has to do with Federal Environment Minister Stephen Guilbeault. Now that's according to political columnist and reporter Brian Lilly. He says that's exactly what Alberta Premier Daniel Smith recently told him during an interview. Mr. Lilly says it appears as though Ontario Premier Doug Ford is also taking issue with Guilbeault as well.
Suddenly, Ford just starts going off on Guilbeault. And at one point he's saying, I don't know who runs the federal government. Is it Stephen Guilbeault or Justin Trudeau? Right now, I can't tell. Guilbeault is a bit of a lightning rod for premiers and premiers of all stripes. Remember, it was Liberal Premier Anthony Furey who led the charge to get the carbon tax taken off of home heating oil because so many of his residents were affected by that, and previously they hadn't been subject to the tax, and it was going to be a big hit. Guilbeault, he could have found a way to work with premiers earlier. He didn't. It came to a flashpoint on that. It's come to a flashpoint on Bill C-69, which the Supreme Court in a reference case has said is largely unconstitutional, but Guilbeault's just acting like it's still there.
Make sure you catch the colorful interview with Brian Lilly and myself coming up in the second half of our program. Lethbridge police are warning parents and caregivers to be aware of violent online groups which have been targeting children. They say last month they received information that through online chats, these groups are grooming young people, manipulating them to participate in self-harm, send sexually explicit images, and to even act out violently against others. Sergeant Kerry Shima with Alert's ICE Division says these predators are targeting vulnerable youth.
A vulnerable youth in our realm isn't necessarily a child who is constantly vulnerable. It may be a day, it may be a moment, it may be a week, it may be a month, but they're targeting as many kids as possible to get them to send sexualized images, to self-harm, and in some cases harm others, or even commit suicide. So these groups here are motivated by ideology and are targeting youth who are vulnerable. So being able to communicate with your kids and being able to identify some of those signs is really important when it comes to them maybe having a bad day or a bad moment or a bad week, something like that. So what we're looking for when we're talking about sextortion or self-harm are things like, especially withdrawing from the family or from their friends is a very big sign. Drastic changes in behavior, changes in the way they dress, purposefully covering up easy to injure areas. So when I'm talking about self-harm, we're talking about hands, arms, wrists, legs, extremities, things like that. So if we're covering things up unusually or wearing clothes that may not be appropriate for the weather or the conditions outside in order to cover up things like that.
Sergeant Shima says more information on red flags to watch out for when it comes to these predators going after your kids can be found on the Alert website. The UCP says that Budget 2024 is passed this week. The province will invest $20 million over the next few years to advance plans to expand the Stollery Children's Hospital in Edmonton. The extra funding will increase the 236 beds, create larger clinical spaces, add more private rooms and dedicated areas as well for both children and their parents. Health Minister Adriana LaGrange says the Stollery is a very busy hospital here in Canada, which helps many children each and every year.
The Stollery Children's Hospital receives more than 300,000 children annually. Can you imagine? 300,000 children cross through these doors, and actually they're spread out over 11 sites. It serves a geographical area of more than 500,000 square kilometers, and it has among the highest inpatient volumes of any children's hospital in Canada. While the staff go above and beyond to deliver world-class care, it is clear that more space is needed to support the growing number of patients and to ensure our providers can continue treating the unique and complex needs of children and young Albertans.
An Edmonton MLA has joined the Alberta NDP leadership race. First-time MLA Jody Callahoo Stonehouse announced her candidacy over the weekend. The 49-year-old joins Calgary MLA Kathleen Ganley, Edmonton MLA Raki Pancholi, and Sarah Hoffman. Rachel Notley's successor will be chosen on June the 22nd. Callahoo Stonehouse, who's the NDP critic for Environment and Parks, said she received more than 100 calls from First Nations elders across the province urging her to run. She says as a First Nations person herself, she's had to work 3 times as hard to get anywhere, and she's ready to lead the party. U.S. President Joe Biden urged the top 4 leaders of Congress to act quickly to avoid a looming government shutdown and to pass emergency aid for Ukraine and Israel. A legislative logjam in the GOP-led House is showing no signs of letting up.
I think the consequences of inaction every day in Ukraine are dire. I've been speaking to some of our G7 partners, and you just got back, Chuck. They're very concerned, and also we need to we need to, in terms of supplemental, we need to deal with the Israeli portion, but that also contains a significant portion having to do with humanitarian assistance into the Palestinian areas, which I think is important. And We have to replenish the air defenses for Israel, and we have to work on making sure they don't face the threat from, they can face the threat from what's going on in the Middle East, not just from Hamas, but from Iran.
TBN Israel's Yair Pinto has been covering the war in Gaza. He says not only has Israel been fighting Hamas, but now tensions have been rising with the Iranian-backed terrorist group Hezbollah in Lebanon. He has more now in this report.
Hezbollah is led by Sheikh Hassan Nasrallah, who has spent decades brandishing his public image into a weapon of psychological warfare against Israel. The speeches he periodically broadcasts are aimed at a wide audience, but there is often an emphasis on the Israeli public. These speeches are dripping with arrogance, coolness, and cynicism. They convey a message that he is vastly more intelligent and powerful than the Israeli leadership. Sometimes they even include hints that he cares about the Israelis more than their own leaders do. And he's actually trying to move things in a direction that would be better for them than what these leaders have in mind. But in his last two speeches, that changed. They did not contain pearls of wisdom or clever turns of phrase, as he likes to use, coming from calculated planning and preparation of the speech. Instead, these were particularly militant speeches, and the main emotion that arose from them was anger. When a calculated and strategic person like Nasrallah loses it, it is a sign of the predicament he's in.
Praying for peace in the Middle East and for the hostages to be returned home soon. So what's the key to having a healthy marriage? Pastors Kelly and Joylyn Stickle from Parallel Church in Lethbridge have been married for about 28 years. They say the key to their successful relationship is being able to read each other's love languages.
With the love languages, like mine are words of affirmation. Mine are most of them, but he says I'm either easy to love or hard to love because I'll take it all. But I'm easy to love, right?
Yes. Right.
So words of affirmation, if he doesn't as much get that or feel loved by that. He feels loved more by the acts of service and stuff. So if I'm constantly just gushing on him with words but don't do anything for him, he's not going to feel that as much.
Make sure you catch the entire interview with the Lovebirds pastors Kelly and Joylyn Stickle from Parallel Church and BCN's Naveen Day coming up later in our broadcast. Well, it was cool and snowy again today in Lethbridge, but fortunately the mercury will be rising. A full look at the weather pictures on deck. Well, we had to endure some more slippery roads here in Lethbridge today. It snows, thaws a little bit, and then freezes again overnight. Speaking of which, tonight there's a chance of more flurries developing with a low near -20. Wednesday, it should clear up quite a bit with the mercury increasing to 6 degrees. Even warmer on Thursday under a mainly sunny sky with a high near 10. Now, a cold front moves in again on Friday, bringing more clouds and cooling off to about -7. Colder with snow and a high of only -12 degrees on Saturday. Light flurries, but warming up to about -8 on Sunday. Monday, it should warm up quite a bit under a partly cloudy sky with a high near +1. Now, the average high for this time of year is 3 degrees with an average low of -9. The record high was 22 degrees set way back in 1992, and the record low was a very chilly -34 back in 1955. The sun rose at 7:19 and will set at 6:10. That gives us just under 11 hours of daylight. Let's see how our home and native land is shaping up across the country tomorrow. Expect showers and a high of 10 degrees in Victoria. Rain and 8 degrees is on tap for Vancouver. The Chinook winds will be blowing in Calgary tomorrow, just a few clouds and a high of 7. Expect lots of sunshine and a high of only -7 in Edmonton on Wednesday. It'll be mainly clear and a high of -11 degrees in Regina. Sunshine and -14 is on tap for Saskatoon. In Winnipeg, expect a clear sky with a high of only -18 on Wednesday. Now, there's a strong warm front which has made its way to central Canada. Expect rain and a high of 14 degrees in Toronto, showers and 13 degrees in both Ottawa and Montreal. In Atlantic Canada, expect some more showers developing and 10 degrees in Fredericton. Showers and 11 is on tap for Halifax. Rain and 12 degrees for Charlottetown. And at St. John's, it should be overcast with rain and a high of 10 degrees on Wednesday. The federal government is freezing the threshold at which the Competition Bureau must be notified of a merger at $93 million. Competition law requires mergers that exceed a certain value be flagged in advance. Officials say this is the way the Bureau can determine whether the deal could prevent or lessen competition. Ottawa says the amount usually increases along with the GDP, but instead the government will freeze it at the same threshold that it's been in place since 2021. Canada's largest theatre owner has made nearly $40 million from online booking fees. Those fees are at the heart of deceptive marketing allegations the Competition Commissioner has made against Cineplex in a case before the Competition Tribunal. The Commissioner says the fees are deceptive because moviegoers are not presented with the full price of a movie ticket on the first page when buying tickets from Cineplex. Now, the company argues, however, that the claims are without merit and should be thrown out because moviegoers are told about fees they may face from the start of the purchasing process. Now, here's a look at today's markets. The TSX was down 5 points on the day to finish at 21,318. The Dow was down 96 points to 38,972. The S&P 500 was up 8 points on the day to finish at 5,078, and the Nasdaq was up 59 points to 15,035. West Texas Intermediate Oil was up 92 cents to $78.50 US per barrel. Natural gas was down 4 cents to $1.62 US. Gold was down 76 cents on the day to finish at $2,030.49 US an ounce, and silver was down 6 cents to $22.46 US an ounce. Feed wheat is at $8.16 per bushel, barley's at $5.99, canola's at $12.92, and corn is at $7.39 per bushel. Live cattle were down 13 cents to $185.60. Feeder cattle March contract was down 5 cents to $253, and lean hogs April contract was down 38 cents to $85.90. The Canadian dollar was up slightly over the past 24 hours to $73.93 US. Recapping one of our top stories, Lethbridge police are warning parents and caregivers to be aware of violent online groups which have been targeting children. They say last month police received information that through online chat groups, these groups groom young people, manipulating them to participate in self-harm, send sexually explicit material, and even to act out violently against other people. Alberta Premier Daniel Smith is apparently calling on Prime Minister Justin Trudeau to call an early election. Political reporter and Sun columnist Brian Lilley, who recently interviewed our Premier, will explain why momentarily. Listen, when you see news happening in your community, be sure to drop us an email at info@bridgecitynews.ca. Also, be sure to visit the new career section on our website and check out the jobs they have posted, including a couple of video journalist positions here in our newsroom. Alberta Premier Daniel Smith has apparently dared Prime Minister Justin Trudeau to call a federal election. Now, we're not supposed to go to the polls until October of 2025, but Smith would like to see a little bit action earlier. Now, to chat about this in more detail is political reporter and Sun columnist Brian Lilley, who joins us once again from Toronto. Brian, you recently had Premier Smith on your podcast, and she says she wants to, quote, clear the air. About what specifically?
Well, we were talking about how Justin Trudeau and his government tend to use Alberta as a bit of a punching bag, right? And it's a constant barrage of either policies or complaints from the central government in Ottawa aimed at Alberta. And so we were talking about her gender policies. We were talking about the clean electricity grid regulations, effectively a production cap on oil and gas. And she said, look, we're used to this here. We're used to Central Canadian Liberals campaigning against Alberta. But if he wants to keep doing that, maybe you should just call an election and clear the air. Got a lot of attention, I can tell you. A lot of people clicking on that story and listening into the podcast to see what she had to say. But it was an interesting discussion about how Alberta is used as a punching bag, as you and I have discussed many times. Justin Trudeau won the narrowest of victories in the 2021 election by campaigning in suburban Vancouver and suburban Toronto against Alberta, which at the time in the election was going through a COVID spike. And he warned suburban mothers in those two areas where he needed to win seats, oh, if you don't vote for us, your kids are in danger because Alberta, and it worked. So Smith just, I think, would like the constant Alberta bashing to stop. Given that I'm a student of history, I would say don't hold your breath, Premier.
Now, Brian, a large portion of your Q&A with the Premier focused on Smith's gender policies and the critics of them. But a recent Leger poll, however, finds more Canadians than not support Smith's policies. As a matter of fact, on the way into work this morning, I saw a billboard from a parents group thanking Premier Smith for, quote, protecting our kids.
Yeah, and it's interesting. It was last week, Prime Minister Trudeau was in Edmonton, and he was really attacking Smith and, by extension, Pierre Poilievre on this issue. And he said, you have to ask why right-wing politicians are suddenly attacking kids. No, they're responding to policies that are being pushed by school boards or municipal governments or health authorities. And they're saying, well, hold on a minute. Let's pause. Let's consider this. It's not an attack on anyone. And Smith's policy was incredibly balanced, from more care for people that do need it and do transition, to trying to find a way, a non-judgmental, non-angry way to deal with the issue of biological males in women's sport. Saying that there should be, in some instances, female only. In others, it would be, co-ed. In others, male only. It is an extremely balanced policy. And I think Canadians see that. And so the Leger poll showed that especially on issues relating to children, top surgery, pronoun changes, they're with the Premier. There is a huge portion that says they don't know. And how, quite frankly, I think that is part of the silent majority who would feel uneasy giving an answer that they might think is politically incorrect. But we've seen time and again with polling that average Canadians are on the side of policies like Smith or Premier Scott Moe or Premier Blaine Higgs, or pronouncements but not policies by people like Ontario Premier Doug Ford. People want to be in the know about their kids. They don't like some of the changes that are coming down, and they want a voice. And so I think the polling shows that people appreciate Smith and others giving them that voice.
Brian, Premier Smith appears to be placing a lot of the blame on the poor relationship between Alberta and Ottawa at the feet of Federal Environment Minister Stephen Guilbeault. Now, didn't Ontario Premier Doug Ford also recently take a shot at Guilbeault?
He did. He was doing a radio interview, the John Oakley show, well-known, long-standing show here in Toronto. And suddenly Ford just starts going off on Guilbeault. And at one point he's saying, I don't know who runs the federal government. Is it Stephen Guilbeault or Justin Trudeau? Right now, I can't tell. Guilbeault is a bit of a lightning rod for premiers, and premiers of all stripes. Remember, it was Liberal Premier Anthony Furey who led the charge to get the carbon tax taken off of home heating oil, because so many of his residents were affected by that, and previously they hadn't been subject to the tax, and it was going to be a big hit. Guilbeault, he could have found a way to work with premiers earlier. He didn't. It came to a flashpoint on that. It's come to a flashpoint on Bill C-69, which the Supreme Court in a reference case has said is largely unconstitutional, but Guilbeault's just acting like it's still there. So he's blocking pipeline projects, he's blocking highway projects, mines, all kinds of things. I mean, if this bill stands and he stays in office, he'll essentially be the planning and zoning department for the entire country, even when it comes to housing development. It's absolutely ludicrous. So yeah, Guilbeault is a problem not just for Alberta, but straight across the country. And it perplexed me when Trudeau did his last cabinet shuffle back in the summer that he left him in, because it really looked like he was going to be, sent packing so that Trudeau could find some peace with the premiers.
Speaking of sending packing, any more talk of Prime Minister Justin Trudeau maybe taking that walk in the snow? What are you hearing?
The last time I checked the forecast for Ottawa, so today is February 27th. His dad famously took the walk in the snow February 29th, 40 years ago. We're about to have a February 29th. It's touch and go whether there will be snow, but I'm sure that people will be looking at the weather forecast. They'll be having their eyes on the grounds of Rideau Hall to see if they see a 6'2" dark-haired man, hair-dyed dark-haired man walking the grounds. But we'll see. I don't think that he's ready to go. I think he wants to battle Pierre Poilievre. My colleague Warren Kinsella and I have constant discussions about this and competing columns in the Toronto Sun, and Kinsella thinks he has to go. I think he wants to stick around and battle Pierre, and that's his ultimate goal. And I've said this to you before. I think that if he can play this Trump card and try and bring down Poilievre's numbers and bring his up while Trump is in the American news cycle, that he'll go to an election early. So far, polling shows it's not working, but it hasn't stopped Trudeau from trying.
Now, Brian, you recently wrote that it was incompetence by the Trudeau government which led to the downfall of a couple of high-flying Alberta-based companies, Calgary-based Lynx Air and Edmonton-based Flair Airlines. Can you explain?
Well, so there's two things, two very separate issues. One, the policies that Canada has had under successive governments, these are not new policies by the Trudeau Liberals, although they've increased the fees on some things. The policies in this country are very different than other countries. And so we look and we say, why can't we have an EasyJet or a Wizz Air or a Ryanair or Southwest? Why can't we have these discount airlines that they have in the rest of the Western world? And the reason is we use a user pay model for our airports. Other countries look at airports as key infrastructure and the government pays for them. We have the air traveler pay for them. But beyond that, this is where the government comes in. They collect rents on the airports. The federal government used to run the airports. They made them so-called not-for-profits with local airport authorities, but they took almost $500 million in rent last year out of these airports. Well, that gets passed on to you. Our jet fuel tax is 158% higher than the Americans. Theirs is 1.5 cents per liter. Ours is 4 cents. And then on top of the jet fuel excise tax, we tax that with the carbon tax and then tax both of those taxes with the GST. The security charges are through the roof compared to the Americans, even though they're very similar. Ours cost a lot more. We don't get better service, trust me. So all of these costs add up, and it makes it difficult to offer that $99 flight from Toronto to Calgary or Calgary to Toronto that would get us going back and forth more. One airline executive from a different competing airline said that on a Toronto to Calgary route, before you pay for an hour of labor, an ounce of fuel, or even a stick of steel to build the plane, you've got $160 in fixed costs for that one-way ticket. That's why we can't have these discount airlines. So there's that. Then on the other side, there's an issue with both airlines not having paid GST on the planes they imported to the tune of $92 million before the federal government came calling. So that both sides show on the one side, a lack of interest in helping a struggling airline sector and helping Canadians get affordable travel. And on the other side, utter incompetence. No small business owner that's listening to me right now can comprehend that you could get away with not paying $92 million of GST before the government came calling. So Flair went bankrupt, owing the government more than $24 million. Lynx went bankrupt, owing the government more than $24 million. Flair is in the middle of paying back $67 million in back payments of GST.
Brian, with the affordability issue, I can see why a lot of Canadians want to exit out of airports in places like Buffalo, where it's more affordable, or even Great Falls, Montana, just outside of Alberta here. Brian, the carbon tax is set to go up again in April. Not many Canadians I know are really in favor of the levy. Now, you say even Ontario Liberals are now shying away from Justin Trudeau's carbon tax?
Yes, Bonnie Crombie, who was a Liberal MP several years ago, and then became mayor of Mississauga, second biggest city in Ontario. She's become leader of the Ontario Liberal Party, and Ontario Premier Doug Ford is trying to brand her as queen of the carbon tax. Now, Ford got into power in 2018, scrapping Kathleen Wynne's cap-and-trade system, which is just carbon tax by another name. He fought the federal carbon tax in court. He's been against it. And now, with the fact of the affordability crisis, Pierre Poilievre's Axe the Tax campaign, the carbon tax is really not popular right now. All of these things coming together. And so Ford has been calling Crombie the queen of the carbon tax. Well, as the legislature returned last week, she held a news conference and people kept asking her, your thoughts on the carbon tax. At first it was, would you bring in a provincial one? Then she did a national TV interview where they said, well, do you even support the federal one? And she would not say. She just kept saying, we're going to study the issue. We'll come back to you. We'll do our homework. We'll make sure she gets it right. I mean, it could have been an easy answer. You just say, well, we don't need one in Ontario because the federal government already has one, and we'll leave it at that. And I support the Prime Minister. She would not even say that. That is how unpopular the carbon tax has become across the country. A recent poll out showing most Canadians think it makes them worse off rather than better off. And the government's message, of course, is you'll get back more than you pay.
Yeah, look at my home heating bills. My gas bill comes in every month on that carbon tax. I agree with that. Now, Brian, the Trudeau government introduced their new online harms bill this week. They say it's about protecting kids, but it also deals with hate crimes and proposes life in prison as a sentence. Now, that appears to be a little out of step from where the Trudeau government normally stands on crime, does it not?
Yeah, you look at Bill C5 that got rid of mandatory minimums for serious gun crimes and effectively reduced the sentences for things like gun smuggling, selling illegal guns, extortion with a gun. They got rid of mandatory minimums on your third repeat offense, your third repeat conviction. In Bill C75, they not only made bail the default position, but on some charges related to terrorism, reduce the sentence to a summary conviction, which in legislation, if you have a summary conviction and it doesn't detail what the sentence should be, that's 6 months in jail. And now they come out with life in prison for promoting genocide and for hate crimes. I'm all in favor of very stiff sentences, Hal. I don't see how life in prison for that. Now, it is up to life in prison. I don't see a judge in Canada ever giving that sentence. And if it did happen, I think it would be overturned and that portion of the law declared unconstitutional. They're trying to show that they're taking this issue very seriously, but it's all performative. Pretty much everything in there surrounding hate crime anyway is already illegal, and there are penalties in there. But the problem is the police don't charge people, the crowns don't prosecute. And so making it doubly illegal with a stiffer penalty isn't going to change anything unless police lay charges and prosecutors prosecute cases.
Brian, a private member's bill brought forward in late November to eliminate hatred in Canada has gone through first reading. Bill C-367 was brought forth by the leader of the Bloc, Yves-François Blanchet. It aims to amend the criminal code to eliminate as a defense against willful promotion of hatred or anti-Semitism that a person in good faith expressed or attempted to establish an opinion on a religious subject or an opinion based on a belief in a religious text. Now, Blanchet says that in a country that claims to be secular or claims that there's a separation between church and state, it's high time that someone took action. But Brian, let me ask you something. Could this create a slippery slope infringing upon religious rights and freedoms?
It absolutely could. And this is also the problem with the Online Harms Act. They're tackling real subjects, but going about it in ham-fisted ways. And it can lead to an awful lot of abuse. And that's one of my main concerns about both bills. As far as Blanchet saying that Canada is a secular state, yes and no. The preamble of our Constitution notes the supremacy of God. Pull a coin out of your pocket right now, and you will see, by the grace of God, well, the older coins would be the Queen, now it's the King. We do not have a separation of church and state. Our head of state is the head of the Anglican Communion worldwide. So we don't have an established official religion in this country, but claiming that there is a separation of church and state, that is an American importation. Quebec has struggled to become very secular after years of dominance by the Catholic Church and laws that, quite frankly, were abhorrent, that would prosecute people for not being Catholic in some instances. And they're trying to go too far with their secularization. But it's a false premise to say that. And then the way that Blanchet is going about it, I don't think is helpful. We can look at the imam who stood on the balcony in Montreal calling for God to kill all Jews to see why he might want that amendment in there. I'm not sure the amendment he has proposed is the way to go about dealing with that gentleman, though.
Brian, it's the second anniversary of the war in Ukraine, and apparently our Prime Minister had a bit of a verbal slip-up when he visited Ukraine and Poland recently. Tell me more.
Yeah, he was giving a news conference with the Polish Prime Minister when he said that Canada is going to continue to stand with Ukraine for as long as it takes, with as much as it takes, because Russia needs to win this war. Look, everybody makes mental mistakes. Everybody misspeaks at times, but that was immediately seized upon by Vladimir Putin and used as propaganda. It was clipped by Russia Today immediately. Russia Today, of course, is a propaganda channel, an English language media outlet paid for by the Kremlin that pushes Putin propaganda. They jumped on that right away. So I'm concerned about that. I'm more concerned that Trudeau has promised an air defense missile system a year ago that he can't even say where it is now and why it hasn't been delivered. I'm more concerned that we've got surplus rockets and munitions in this country that Ukraine has asked for, knowing that not all of them work, but saying they will work with what is available and we won't give it to them. I'm concerned that we won't provide the support that the manufacturers, the private sector manufacturers, need to feel secure in ramping up production for artillery shells in this country, so knowing that they will be paid for and allowed to be exported. Those are more concerning. But of course, giving Putin a propaganda win is never a good thing.
Now, while Trudeau has visited Ukraine many times since the Russian invasion, Brian, he hasn't visited Israel in a show of solidarity since the horrific attacks by Hamas back on October the 7th. Why do you think that is?
Well, I actually, as I watch the actions of the Trudeau government, at first they were solidly behind Israel. Then they tried to walk a line. They have been pleasing no one with this walking of the line. I was speaking with one friend recently who said, look, the Muslim community is abandoning the Liberals because they feel he is not taking a strong enough position on Gaza. Talking with other friends who said the Jewish community is doing the same. Trudeau's polling is being hurt by this. Now, this is not a polling issue, but it's just showing that he's trying to walk an imaginary line that doesn't exist. But lately, it feels like he and his government are going over to Team Hamas. International Development Minister Ahmed Hussein went to Egypt and Jordan, and he kept posting videos on social media making false claims about what Israel was doing regarding letting aid in or not letting aid in. He did not call out Hamas. He called out Israel to stop the fighting, but didn't mention Hamas. You look at Melanie Joly, the foreign minister, meeting with her counterpart from South Africa to talk about Gaza. South Africa is the country that took Israel to the International Criminal Court, or the International Court of Justice, sorry. They invited and hosted Hamas leaders in Johannesburg before deciding to move forward with that court case. They are cozy with Hamas. These are all very worrying signs going on in the backfield for anyone watching this closely.
Political reporter and Sun columnist Brian Lilley, thanks again for joining us from Toronto.
Thank you, Hal.
You know, maybe people agree that marriage is a relationship ordained by God, but it can be tricky to keep that relationship thriving. Today's guests are going to help us do that. Kelly and Joylyn Stickle are a husband and wife team, and they are the lead pastors of Parallel Church right here in Lethbridge. Pastors Kelly and Joylyn, welcome back to Bridge City News. It's great to have you on today.
Thanks, that was great to be here.
Excellent. Now, I'm curious, how long have you two been married now?
28 years.
Wow.
Double check that, yeah.
Been a while.
To look at each other. So the romance sometimes can fade in marriage, and it's entirely possible that we may not even notice the signs. Why is that?
I think it's easy to just kind of do the motions, go through life, especially when things get busy and you have kids and the kids get busy and stuff. And so it's easy to kind of lose that and not see it happen unless you're intentional. I think intentional is a big part of marriage.
Yeah, absolutely. It's easy to drift. It's easy to have just the busyness of life kind of occupy or preoccupy what the focus is. So like Joylyn said, is you have to be intentional in making effort to make sure that the marriage is priority over all of the distractions that can potentially come.
Yeah.
And once you notice the romance thermometer is dropping down, what steps should be taken to get the temperature back up again?
I think a big part of that again is the intentionality of making sure daily you're having connected time with one another, that whether that's a deep conversation or whatever, just to make sure that a priority daily. Weekly, it's great to go on dates and set aside an evening or time with each other.
Yeah.
We like to quarterly get away for a night or two, yearly go on a holiday that just the two of us away from the kids and distractions of life, and kind of rekindle relationship there that way. But again, it's intentionally saying, okay, we're going to put that in our calendar. We're going to make it a priority, make our marriage a priority, and focus on doing just that and putting in the calendar, not just saying we want to,
Yeah.
but actually put it in the calendar.
Yeah. Yeah. And I think the Bible says where your treasure is, your heart is there also. And so I think it doesn't necessarily have to be a physical treasure, but if you figure out what your spouse's love language is and how they feel loved and connected, then intentionally putting that treasure into your marriage, your heart will follow if it's kind of lagging behind. But yeah, I think it's easy, like we had said, it's easy to kind of get overwhelmed and just go through the motions. So just being intentional, putting it in your calendar is a big part of it.
Now let's talk about married couples for a bit here, because long ago I was married and didn't last very long, but I want to talk about like the honeymoon phase, because that can wear off sometimes. And I noticed that very early on into my marriage, I started noticing things like, oh, like she's snoring louder than she normally does, or like has her morning breath always been that pungent? So what are some steps to stay in that honeymoon phase or keep it going longer?
I think the honeymoon stage is often what we classify as the feelings of love, that feeling part of love, which is there, and it's a real thing. But love is much deeper than just the emotions that we feel at on a time. And so when we get familiar with someone and we get to know them, we get to see the real them. Sometimes the feelings aren't there, but what Paul describes love in 1 Corinthians 13 is like, love is patient. Well, I don't remember the last time I had the feeling of being patient. It's not a feeling driven thing at all. And love is kind. Love is doesn't envy. Love is keeps no record of wrongs. None of what he lists in 1 Corinthians 13 is based on feelings. So there are decisions that we have to make on a daily basis and push beyond the feelings, the emotions, the triggers, all those things, and just say no, despite the nuances of being imperfect people with one another, that we're going to push beyond that and choose to love, choose to be kind, choose to be patient, choose to be keep no records of wrong, and make those choices every day.
Yeah. And I think it's important to recognize that, especially however long we've been married, you're always growing as a person, or you should be always growing as a person, and your spouse is always growing as a person. So if you are stuck in who they were when you were dating, and not allowing them the chance to grow and the growing pains that go with that, then you're taking away a lot of what real life is. And the beauty of being in a partnership like a marriage is that you get to grow each other, and you get to iron sharpens each other, right?
Right.
And it's a cool thing to just give them the space and give yourself the space to become who you're becoming. And that is hard sometimes, right?
Yes.
Now, obviously, it's important for couples to communicate in some fashion that you love and appreciate one another. I mean, I've heard some guys say like, well, I told you when I met you I love you, and if anything changes, I'll let you know. Obviously, that's not healthy. So any suggestions on how we can do this and how often we need to show our love and appreciation?
Love languages.
Yes.
Yeah. I think you should be the biggest cheerleader for your spouse, and you should be the biggest student of your spouse. And so figuring out who they are and how they feel love, and yeah, and show them that way, because it's they're going to feel it better that way. So with the love languages, like mine are words of affirmation. Mine are most of them, but he says I'm either easy to love or hard to love, because I'll take it all. But I'm easy to love, right?
Yes, very easy.
So words of affirmation, if he doesn't as much get that, or feel loved by that, he feels loved more by the acts of service and stuff. So if I'm constantly just gushing on him with words but don't do anything for him, he's not going to feel that as much. And so again, being intentional, being the student of your spouse, and making it your priority to study who they are and how they feel loved is a big part of it.
And if couples haven't read that book, The Five Love Languages, it's a must for every marriage. And the natural tendency for all of us, is like Joylyn said, is to give what we receive naturally ourselves, is to give that back. But that's not necessarily the language that our spouse receives. And so we need to be able to speak their language over our own preferences, and give preference to what they need most, and do that on a daily basis. Like that's not something that you let slide for a while and say at the altar and never say again. like it's a daily practice of making sure that they feel loved and cherished, and our priorities over anyone and everyone else.
Yeah.
I agree what you said about the five love languages, because it's amazing that that book has really gained popularity even in non-faith relationships. In fact, being on dating apps, I've noticed a lot of people are even asking what their love languages, asking each other what their love languages are, or saying these are my love languages, or they're sharing their Myers-Briggs. But what really fascinated me was they are talking about love languages. So I think that's really fascinating, that something that came from a Christian author is really so popular amongst all kinds of relationships here. Now, I've also noticed that marriage experts encourage couples to find things that they both enjoy and to do those things together. But that can be tough to find time with kids and work, etc. So how do you find time?
I don't think you ever find time. I think you have to make time.
You claim time.
You claim time. And I think you have to make it a priority and saying, okay, well, if we just wait to find time, life's going to eat that up really quick. I think you have to be intentional and make the time, and pay attention rather than just get distracted or what grabs your attention. Pay attention, make the effort to pay attention to your spouse, make the time to be together and to do things that you enjoy together.
And I think it's super healthy for kids to see a strong relationship between parents and to not be the center of attention. So they're going to go into stronger relationships when they're older if they've seen it demonstrated throughout their life, and they've seen dad prioritize mom over them sometimes too, right? And vice versa. And so you're helping your children by showing them how a good relationship works, and that mom and dad are prioritized, and that gives them security as well, to know that that they're secure in the family.
Now, today's couples typically watch a lot of TV programs together, and there's a lot of binge-worthy content out there. But they can also get influenced by social media, and this can portray a somewhat unrealistic view of what a husband or wife should look like and how they should behave. Do we need to adjust our marriage expectations?
Absolutely. I think social media has probably done a greater disservice, I think, than even television lately.
Yeah.
I think a lot of times what we do, we walk right into the comparison trap, where we begin to compare our behind the scenes to somebody's highlight reels. And we have to recognize that what is portrayed on social media is somebody's highlight reels. You're not seeing behind the scenes. You're not seeing all the messes and the messiness of life that is real.
Yep.
And so it's dangerous to watch somebody on social media or watch a marriage on social media and going, oh, I wish my husband was like, or I wish my wife was more like, or I wish our marriage was like that. A very dangerous thing to do, to walk into that comparison trap. And it puts undue expectations on yourself, but undue expectations on your spouse, and recognize, hey, our marriage is different than anybody else's, but this is our marriage. We don't, this is our relationship. This is our personalities coming together to becoming one. And it's not going to look like everybody else's.
And over time, we can start to get critical of one another, especially like if we're seeing the same person every single day, day in, day out, every day, every weekend. How can couples break that cycle of negative communication?
In the art of communication, like, psychologists will talk about changing the story in your head. And oftentimes we go in with a preconceived, especially to those that we're closest with, we go into a preconceived idea of, oh, they did that on purpose, or they're trying to, and we ended up getting critical because they forgot this again, or it's just like them, this. And psychologists say, change the story in your head. And like Jorlyn said, is hey, when we were in love, when we got married, why would somebody who loves me so much promise, their lives with mine? Why would they intentionally try to hurt me? If I can change the story, they're not intentionally trying to hurt me. And just simply changing the story in my own head is going to allow me to enter into the communication with not defensiveness, not angst. It's going to allow me to enter the conversation with, hey, being open and saying, hey, this hurt me. I felt this, and I know you didn't mean it, but I felt this, and it becomes a lot easier to have a conversation than going in accusatory.
Yeah.
And as unique and wonderful as we all are, that means we are all wired slightly differently, which can lead to some conflict. So once an argument starts, what advice do you have on how to fight fair?
Well, some of the advice that I use, and we use, and that we counsel other couples in, is to avoid starting an argument with an accusation. So avoid starting an argument with you always. We typically say things like, you're always late, or you never do this for me, or whatever. And we encourage people to not use the words always and never, because they're never true. And to not start a discussion with an accusation with you. Instead, begin the discussion with, or turn the discussion with, hey, I feel when this happened, when you didn't show up on time, when I expected, I felt disappointed, or I felt this. And it's very difficult. People do it, but it's very difficult to argue with someone's feelings. And it's more like, oh, I didn't mean to do that, I'm sorry. We end up typically going into a more of having a conversation about the real issues, rather than arguing over, well, I was on time. You're always late. No, I was on time 3 weeks ago. We start nitpicking over the little details, and the argument goes way off the rails, and becomes accusatory. So our natural response when somebody accuses us is to get defensive, and then we fight back. But if somebody begins the conversation with, I feel, it's, I'm not feeling like I need to get defensive, and I'm not feeling like I need to go on an attack mode. I want to have now the conversation and get to the real heart of the issue.
Yeah. And you need to make space for grace in your marriage, in yourself, and in others, right? And it's just the grace that we get from God. We need to be thankful for that and extend it to others.
I love that. Make space for grace. And how important is it to sincerely apologize for the wrongs and to forgive one another and leave the past in the past?
Very important, I think, just with anybody, right? Like, you hear it said that unforgiveness hurts you more than anyone else. But when you're in a tight marriage and a partnership, it's going to hurt anybody around you. And the shrapnel from that is going to just continue to hurt people. And so it's important for your own health. It's important for your marriage and your family and any dynamic around you to forgive and just to move on and work through things. Definitely, if there's things that need to be worked through, and let go of things that just need to be forgiven and moved past.
And what about making time for date nights? Is that still something that should happen regularly, even if you have a tight budget? I know a lot of people are cutting back on things, and I think their recreation and their pleasure time is really taking a hit these days.
Yeah. Yeah, I think there's ways. A lot of the excuses or a lot of the reasons are children, and I think there's ways to like babysit, share. I guess having friends that have little kids and say, okay, this week you have all the kids, and this week I'll have all the kids, and figure out ways to take care of your kids, and figure out ways it doesn't have to cost. We have lots of date nights at home, and we enjoy those, and it costs a lot less, and yeah.
And I think if you take money out of the equation, it allows you to become a lot more creative,
Yeah.
which becomes a lot more fun as to what you're going to be able to do, and saying, well, hey, let's what can we do without spending money, or even, what we like to do is put into budget date nights and saying it's going to be a regular part of our finances, in putting into our budget, so that we're not, bracing and going, well, we can't afford to,
Yeah, and
we
then it's
can't
not
do
as
that.
fun.
Then it's not as fun. Then you're feeling the pressure of
Yeah.
the finances as well, which takes away from the whole purpose of the night anyway. So
Yeah. Well, and then you're prioritizing again. In your budget, you might need to cut back on different things, but you're like, that's important because I get my date night with my husband, and that's going to be long-term importance.
yeah.
Kelly and Joylyn Stickle are the lead pastors of Parallel Church in Lethbridge. Kelly and Joylyn, thanks so much for sharing with us today.
Thank you so much.
Thanks, guys.
I'm Naveen Day. On behalf of all of us here at Bridge City News, thanks for watching.